Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this virtual roundtable. My name is Emily Taylor and I'm one of the founders of the DNS Research Federation, a UK not-for-profit dedicated to advancing the understanding of the domain name system's impact on cybersecurity, policy and technical standards. It's brilliant to see so many people joining us for this virtual roundtable, which will showcase the research projects that examine diverse aspects of technical standards, from community dynamics to corporate influence and geopolitics in standard settings. So these research projects are part of the DNS Research Federation's Internet Standards Observatory, which aims to facilitate engagement in standards and identify proposals that might deepen fragmentation while also promoting engagement to address these issues. So as part of this initiative, we announced a call for papers, inviting researchers from around the world to explore how standards can contribute to preventing fragmentation and what cooperation strategies might be required to protect the interoperable internet. So 7 exceptional research projects were selected for funding under this call, and these projects are what you'll be hearing from today. And these provide relevant background and evidence-based analysis to understand fragmentation through the lens of standards and explore how to cooperate openly and with diverse stakeholder participation. So before handing over to my colleagues, I'd like to give thanks to the Internet Society Foundation and RIPE NCC, who've provided the financial support to facilitate this aspect of the Internet Standards Observatory. And I'd also personally like to thank Carolina Caira, who leads our standards work, and Georgia Osborne, who leads our research community building, for their work in organising today's discussions. So I'll stop talking now and hand over. I'm very excited to hear from the researchers and my colleagues. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those kind words and introduction, Emily, and welcome everyone. My name is Carolina Cairo. I am Senior Internet Policy Specialist at the DNS Research Federation, and I will be moderating this first segment of the roundtable discussion today. So the focus of this first segment is the dynamics of standard setting, cooperation, and community as a means to counter internet fragmentation. And the goal really of this first segment is to provide some scene setting for today's discussions. We have 3 researchers with us who have used a combination of quantitative and qualitative research methods to uncover how stakeholders who oftentimes have divergent views or represent competing organizations collaborate in developing interoperable standards across IETF and W3C. And essentially, we see these forms of cooperation among expert communities as a means to prevent and counter internet fragmentation. So without further ado, let's dive into these presentations. I will invite Ignacio Castro from Queen Mary University of London to present and understanding internet standardization processes through longitudinal data-driven analysis. Ignacio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Can you confirm that you can see my slides?
We can indeed.
Brilliant. So, well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here. I wanted to talk about what I think is a very important thing, which is the benefits that we can have from having a more data-driven approach to analyzing standards. And one of the reasons why I say this is because when I go to different forums, like in particular, I remember the last one, the Internet Global Forum, I heard many people talking about how difficult the technical standardization community is and how inaccessible it is. And I was very surprised. And I was talking with people and saying, but what are you talking about? Like, it's not a closed community. It's in fact very open. But what I came to realize is that open doesn't mean accessible. We have very long communication intensive and complex communications about a very complex aspect. However, there are huge benefits, I believe, in doing this data-driven analysis because it can reveal many things about the internet and the standardization community itself. because the internet depends on its on interoperability. This requires coordination, and we somehow reflect this coordination in standardization, and in particular in the case of the internet, and in particular in the case of the IETF, this is pretty much open. All the mails are open, all the drafts are open, and by analyzing this, we can learn a lot about internet-wide dynamics as well as standardization, organization dynamics, and some of the things that we can see is that, well, if you see this, what you can see here is from 2001 to 2020, the number of days that it takes from the first draft in the IETF until the draft is published as an RFC. And what you can see is a threefold increase in the time to publish. Well, indeed, open doesn't mean accessible. Who has the time to be following the publication of a standard over 3 years? But it's not only that, it's not only it takes a lot of time, it's that it takes a lot of emails. What you can see here is in blue, the number of unique email participants per year, and in red, the number of emails sent per year. And what you can see is a divergence, and that divergence means that the number of emails per person in the IETF is increasing substantially over the years. Again, open doesn't mean accessible. Who has the time to follow all the emails that are related to the areas of their interest? However, if we were able to have a better understanding, we were able to leverage this data analysis better, there are many things that we can learn. Like, for example, we could learn about the interests of different stakeholders. So, for example, what you can see here is the number of drafts that different organizations co-author. And what you can see, you can immediately see some patterns. Like, for example, you can see some organizations that tend to collaborate mostly with members on their own organization. You can see some regional preferences. China Mobile collaborates much more with Huawei than with almost anyone else. And can also see kind of a small clique of some of the most proactive members of the community, mostly collaborating with each other. But this is just one of the many things that you can look at. Like, you can see standardization dynamics, which I've talked a little bit about. You could foresee regulatory challenges. Like, for example, if you have a system that relies on DNS to prevent people from accessing certain material without declaring their age, and suddenly DOH comes around, well, that's going to be a problem. Or you could also look at competition tussles, who are standardizing which technologies and in which area. You can also see innovation cycles. Like, probably you can see how some technologies have become a commodity, and slowly we only have incremental improvements, where others are probably thriving, as well as potentially security threats, depending on which type of encryptions, lack of encryptions, or debates around it we have. And this is part of an ongoing work that I'm doing with colleagues, some of them here from St. Andrews and from Glasgow University. And it's part of this work and another project. And also we have a research group at the IRTF, RASP, Research Analysis of Standardization Processes, which covers some of this work, not only mine, but also from some other colleagues. And if this is of interest, I invite you to follow. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ignacio, for sticking to the 5-minute brief that we've given speakers. That was really impressive. I think you hit the 4-minute mark. And thank you for sharing those insights about, how much we can learn about these, cooperation strategies and what it means to deliver interoperable standards in terms of sort of the time and sort of resources that standards participants have to invest in being able to participate, essentially. I would like to invite next Stephen McQuisting from the University of St. Andrews to present Internet Standards, Measuring the Impact of SDO Policies and Working Practices. And I will say as well, in terms of session dynamics, we're going to go through the 3 presentations that we have lined up for this first segment. And then we're actually going to open to questions, answers, comments from the audience as well. So start thinking about your questions and comments. And yeah, Stephen, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so my name is Stephen McQuiston from the University of St. Andrews. And I'm going to be outlining my DNSRF project that is looking to measure the impact that the different policies and working practices that SDOs have in terms of the resilience and robustness of the standardization community. So in terms of the objective of the project, then, again, it's simply about trying to identify sort of best practice in terms of those working practices that, as I say, strengthen cooperation and that encourage wide engagement in the standardization process. And hopefully that produces then a standards community that is more resilient and more robust and is therefore going to be able to give the proper scrutiny to any proposals that come along and any new work that appears in those organizations. This project has been looking at data from two SDOs, the W3C and the IETF. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we've been looking at those organizations. First of all, these two organizations have fairly different policies and different ways of working. So, for example, the W3C has a more formal membership model, whereas the IETF doesn't. The IETF is largely carries out its work on mailing lists, whereas the W3C uses GitHub. And so we've got this good data set of different working practices and the results that they have in terms of the community. And the second reason is that there is an overlap in these two communities. There's an overlap in terms of participation. So we have individuals that participate, individuals and organizations that participate in both. And again, that gives a really nice data set to try and answer some of the questions that we've got. So thinking about the sort of research questions then that we're going to try and answer, I don't have time to go through all three of these, so I'll just focus on this third one. So we're going to think about the impact that different modalities, different ways of engaging with the process have in terms of participation. So those modalities might be sort of in-person meetings or using mailing lists or using GitHub to engage with the standards process. And then we're going to think about what impact that has in terms of the underlying community, the underlying standards community. So I'm going to very briefly outline some early findings that we've got. So here we're plotting the volume of messages that are produced by both the IETF and the W3C across two modalities, so across mailing lists and across GitHub. Again, this is all public data, so we don't know anything about perhaps what happens in private mailing lists and private repositories. But what we can see really here is that the W3C has almost entirely shifted towards using GitHub for its sort of day-to-day public standardization activity. We can see that the IETF is starting to use GitHub, but that's a much less pronounced volume of messages. And what that gives us then is a really nice data set. We've got lots of activity in the W3C before it transitioned to GitHub, and lots of activity after that transition. And then we can also compare and contrast between the two organizations because we've got the IETF that's still largely using mailing lists and the W3C that's using GitHub. And so we can then think about what the impact that has then in terms of the sort of resilience and the robustness of the community. Does working using a different set of tools have an impact on how people engage with the process? Again, this is early work, and I don't have time to sort of explain all of the metrics that I'm plotting here, but essentially we're plotting here a couple of measures of resilience of the underlying standards community. So the number of connected components and the size of the largest connected component. And what we can see is that sort of correlating with the sort of switch towards GitHub, we can see that the W3C community has become more closely knit. It's become people are talking to each other more. Of course, you know, there are other factors here that we need to unpick as we go through the research, but what it does suggest is that there might be some impact based on the tools and the technologies that we use to carry out the standards work. Now, I just want to sum up. I'll put the sort of original objective of the work up there while I sum up. Again, it's all about identifying best practice. The goal here isn't to sort of compare and contrast the IETF and the W3C and conclude which organization is better or worse, but it's about identifying the ways of working that might in cooperation and engagement, and to try and share that best practice across all of the standards developing organizations. Now, as Ignacio summed up, this is part of a project that's received UK EPSRC funding, the SodaStream project. I encourage you to visit the website. We've got lots of papers and lots of prior work in this area. And as Ignacio also said, this is work with collaborators at the University of Glasgow, Queen Mary University of London, HKUST as well. And this work builds on that collaboration. And with that, I think I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that presentation and that exploration of potential best practices. I would like to now move on to our third and last presentation for this segment. Yag Desai from South Asian University will present on the role of expert communities in setting standards for quantum technologies. Yag, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So this is the topic for my presentation. And as you can see, there's a small asterisk next to it, and I'll explain shortly why that is. Epistemic communities are basically networks of experts with authoritative domain knowledge and also the legitimacy that comes with it to influence policy in those issue areas. And standardization organizations are, of course, filled with experts. But the question is whether these experts share certain common causal beliefs and value orientations and the kind of goal of the broader project. And so that is the question that I'm trying to explore is, do we find these kind of informal communities emerging in standardization, and how exactly do they influence standardization processes, but also the implementation of standards and the subsequent policy ramifications, especially in the context of emerging technologies like quantum. So a brief introduction to quantum technologies for those who are not familiar. So we are currently undergoing the second quantum revolution, where we've learned to exploit the unique physics of atomic scale particles. And broadly, we can categorize this, the technologies here as computing, communications, and sensing. So in computing, basically, we are performing computation in a very different way, which can turbocharge the kind of computation we do, and that creates certain risks. So today's focus is actually on post-quantum cryptography, which is not a quantum technology per se, but a response to quantum computing, which has the potential to break the popular public key encryption systems such as RSA, Diffie-Hellman, and elliptical curve. And this is because of an algorithm discovered in the 90s called Shor's algorithm. And so post-quantum cryptography is basically coming up with algorithms that can resist this advanced power of quantum computing. And this is an active area of research, not a settled science. And there are several algorithms that have been broken while they were in the process of being standardized. So this is really just happening as things go. But as of now, we don't have quantum computers that can actually break the public key algorithms which are widely deployed. So this is a threat that is at least a decade away, but we have to start taking steps now. So the standardization organization that has been most active in this space is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is an American national standardization organization. And they have an open competition style process for standardization. Even though it is a national standardization body, they've chosen to create a very open kind of a standardization process for this, because they realize that as this is an active research area, they require transparency and an inclusive approach to harness the power or the expertise of the entire cryptographic community, and also make sure that the resulting standards have the legitimacy to be widely deployed as comparable with the current cryptographic standards. And since the algorithms have a lot of diverse properties, you cannot simply choose one standard that is the best, because you have to base this decision on a number of properties that these algorithms have, which makes the selection of the algorithm ultimately a subjective decision. And again, this is where the power of the broader community and the intersubjective decision making comes into play to ensure that the algorithm that is being standardized is considered legitimate, is trusted, so that it can be widely deployed. So this is briefly the timeline of how NIST has gone about it, from organizing different conferences to having an open mailing list. It has really been a collaborative effort in creating these standards. And here we can see that most of the Western powers have essentially committed to using NIST standards because of the legitimacy that the process has gained. And what we see is that because of this kind of open process of NIST and the default openness that the Internet Engineering Task Force has, we see that these standards will also be implemented or embedded into the existing broader Internet standards of the IETF. And there are a number of working groups in this space. And one important aspect here is that because these standards are already out there, any kind of transition that has to take place, usually to change infrastructure, it takes more than a decade. So it is crucial that these communities choose standards and its implementation in a way that can really be trusted, because you cannot make these kind of transitions again and again. So I'll stop there, and thank you. If you have any feedback, please do reach out to me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yag, for sort of emphasizing the role of these expert communities in sort of shaping the standards for emerging technologies like quantum. I think that is a great point that puts the spotlight on the communities developing the standards. We do have some comments in the chats, and I do also have some questions prepared, but I'd like to give participants the opportunity to come in now to post some of their questions. Andrew, would you be open and willing to open your mic and ask your question about RFCs and time to publication with the group? Thank you.
Yeah, happy to, if you can hear me okay.
We can indeed. Please go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. And I know Ignacio partly addressed this in the chat, but my question was really from some of the IETF activity. It seems to me that the authorship of RFCs can make a material difference to how long it takes and transition from draft to RFC. And for example, something that comes out of Apple or Google, or who have authors who coincidentally happen to be employees of Apple or Google, they seem to maybe transition the standards process in the IETF rather more quickly than something from a less well-established author, sort of regular company, rather than one of those with significant market power. So yeah, give Ignacio a chance to maybe amplify his answer to that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Andrew. That's a very good point. I think that's one of the reasons why data-driven analysis can be so revealing, because indeed it can reveal things like this. I mean, to begin with, if you have a lot of members from the same organization, creating a standard, the likelihood that they will agree with each other is probably greater than if they are from competing organizations. Of course, this is just a hypothesis, but it sounds like quite of a reasonable one. You also have cases where things have been, let's say, cooked at home and brought for baking to the IETF, which I mean is a good thing from the fact that it's an open organization is so relevant that even if you do something by yourself, you still want to bring it to the public arena. To get it published. But indeed, there are many of these cases, and analyzing relatively simple statistics can be quite revealing, I believe, in identifying these cases.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew and Ignacio for that point. I do wonder, Stephen, if you see any similar dynamics playing at W3C in terms of, certain dominant players perhaps having more influence. I don't know if you'd found that in your measuring at all.
It's not something that we've got the data to support yet, but sort of anecdotally from conversations, I think that perhaps the sort of formal membership model maybe sort of ameliorates some of that effect, right? So each member gets a say, whereas with the IETF it's much less formal, and so you see some of the effects that Ignacio mentioned. Whereas in W3C, because there's that more formal model, I think it's much less pronounced.
Wonderful. And I think, that ties, quite nicely into a question we discussed, I guess, in preparation for this session, which is, in this first segment, we're discussing, okay, how much we can learn from data-driven analysis. We also know certain organizations are more or less transparent than others. There's, different sort of levels of data that's made available publicly. So how in your research, what limits are you finding as well in terms of the inferences and findings that you can draw from your data-driven analysis? I'd be happy for any of you to take that one.
I'm happy to take a first step. Well, first of all, the data is dirty and the data is noisy. So understanding what's going on by looking at the data is not trivial, and without having a little bit of informed knowledge, it's very difficult to interpret what you are seeing. So that's actually one thing. In general, I think that having cleaner systems to collect and organize data by any organization that does open work would be fantastic. And I think this is very important because maybe those that are very dedicated to a particular technical aspect don't need it that much. But if you're a policymaker, if you're a civil society, you don't have a deep technical understanding, or you have a large number of things that you are interested in following, it is very difficult to track them down with this volume of data and the level of complexity. Another thing is that once you find something, the interpretation is a very different thing. And without having some theory, some knowledge that can direct and make sense of the things that you are seeing in the data, is really difficult to have a good interpretation of what's going on.
I think just to sort of balance Ignacio's point there, certainly the two organizations that we've been looking at, so the W3C and IETF, I think they're both open to sharing more data. I think we're really just at the beginning of this sort of data-driven analysis sort of trend, and both have APIs and both are making more and more data available. So it is good to see, and obviously that's going to be informed by the sort of work that we do here about encouraging those bodies to share as much data as possible and to show the value of sharing that data. If we can inform the processes, then we're showing that sharing that data is useful for them and the way that they work. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you wanted to come in next. Please go ahead.
If I can just add to that. So in my work, I think understanding the influence of socialization in these organizations and informal communications is not always easy to get from the data that is published by these organizations. And that is where the barriers to entry and the accessibility issue really comes into play.
Wonderful. Well, seeing there are no more questions from the audience, I do, encourage people to, raise their hands or, type questions in the chat if they want to come in. I wanted to take the three of you actually to sort of the initial hypothesis that we posed at the beginning of this session, and it's this notion that from an internet fragmentation perspective, we say that cooperation in standards is a way to uphold interoperability. It's a way of ensuring that, we have resilient communities that are developing standards that can provide the adequate scrutiny for the proposals that they're vetting. Ignacio, you did show, however, that, there is some levels perhaps of concentration. There are dominant players. So is that, the existence of these dominant players, is that detrimental to the development of standards? Do we need more stakeholder diversity in the development of standards? Is this just the status quo, the way things are, and the way it's always been? What are your thoughts on these points?
That's a good question. I think of the underlying ecosystem that is different stakeholders in order to have a thing interoperable. So a particular technology is mostly dominated by a subset of stakeholders. This will be reflected in the standardization process, and actually trying to force to have other not be particularly helpful because it might not be representative of the reality that is happening there. So I think that in some cases it might be dangerous to try to solve things at this layer when the problem is at a different layer. If we have internet consolidation, as many reports have found, we have few cloud players, we have few players in different aspects. This will be reflected in the standardization community. Just bringing more people into the standardization debate might not solve the problem because the problem simply just lies somewhere else. But again, looking at the data from standardization might be a relatively easy way to understand those bottlenecks and where greater competition or diversity could be something positive for the internet in general.
Any other takers on that question?
I think the openness process that would definitely help, but ultimately it really depends on, like Ignacio said, the area that is being standardized and what are the dominant interests and how they end up shaping the standardization process itself.
Wonderful. We do have a comment from Mark McFadden. Mark, would you be willing to come on camera to share your comments?
Let me see here. Good morning, good afternoon. What's interesting about, let me take care of that problem. What's interesting about the time to publish problem in the IETF, it's a well understood fact that the time to publish metric is getting larger as time goes on. But the time to publish metric is a fairly high, large grained kind of metric for studying the IETF, because time to publish is made up of many, many small components. The amount of time that a draft is an individual draft, the amount of time that it's adopted as a working group item and worked on in that phase, the amount of time it goes through last call. I could go on and on. As a working group chair, what I was surprised by was the amount of time between when a document is agreed on by a working group and agreed on by the IESG to the time that it's published is remarkably large. And in my experience as a working group chair has been getting larger. And so it would be interesting, not that I'm proposing work for anybody here, but it would be interesting to see a little finer grained granularity on the study of the data, so that instead of just looking at raw time to publish numbers, we take a look at, well, what was happening in the RFC editor queue, or what was happening, how long were drafts taking to get from an individual submission to a working group submission. And I would say to you that one of the things that we've seen is that it's taking a long time to get through working group adoption for a lot of documents. And that's causing some of the problems, or at least in the working groups that I've either chaired or been a part of. So it's a research question about what are the components for this time to publish metric, because the conclusion that was drawn here was that if it takes 2 years to get a document published in the IETF, and I would say that that's a relatively optimistic number, who can afford to spend 2 years of their life on that? And I think doing a little more causal analysis of the finer grained metrics would help us understand why that's happening. That was my comment, Carolina.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. And I think that goes to the point that Ignacio made earlier about identifying the bottlenecks as well. So certainly, I think there's plenty of room for additional research there. We are out of time actually for the first segment. So I would like to thank our three researchers, Ignacio, Stephen, and Jörg, for their presentations. And I will now pass on to my colleague, Georgia Osborne, for the moderation of the second segment. Georgia?
Thank you so much, Carolina. And of course, any questions can be asked in this section as well. So hello, everyone. I'm Georgia Osborne. I'm Academic Outreach and Research Community Lead for the DNS Research Federation. What we have just seen has outlined the dynamics of the standards development bodies, cooperation and community. And for this session, it's a pleasure to be moderating on this particular session, which is titled Corporate Influence in Standards, Too Much Clout or Industry-Led Innovation, where we'll be looking at corporate influence or influence leading to standards by various stakeholders, looking at the research which examines some of the makeup of activity in the SDOs. This session will include 2 presentations showcasing some of the research projects. For the first research project, I'd like to invite Clément Perrineau, from VUB University in Belgium, and Francesca Musiani to the floor. She is from the National Centre for Scientific Research in France. Thank you very much. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Georgia, and thanks so much for having us in this program of grants and today. So we are going to present in a few minutes time so our ongoing work on the QUIC protocol. So we entitled provisionally entitled our paper "QUIC or the Battle That Never Was: A Case of Infrastructure in Control over Internet Traffic." So we are actually from two different institutions, but working closely together on a working group on internet governance spearheaded by CNRS. So next slide, please, Clement. So what we aim to do in this paper is to uncover what has been infrastructured by QUIC. I'll come shortly after back to what we mean by using this as a verb instead of a noun. It's a science and technology studies ongoing thing. So we do in this study, we do focus on a number of key controversies that are related to encryption, state sovereignty, and surveillance. And we explore, and so like the theme of this panel comes in perfectly, we explore more particularly in this context, the affordances of Google in reshaping the technical architecture of the internet via the standardization process. So our research question has been, what has been both enabled and constrained by the QUIC standardization process, and what are the implications of this for the future of the internet? Next slide, please. As for our methodology and theoretical framework, we combine our respective standpoints, academic standpoints on political science and science and technology studies. And we do refer to the literature in internet governance and beyond that has addressed standard setting and very frequently in an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary manner. And we also draw from literature in internet governance that has previously examined how infrastructures can be promoted and co-opted for other motives than the technical functionalities that they initially aim to fulfill. It's some work I moved forward with Lord and Ardis notably in a few years back. We draw on the concept of infrastructuring. So it's a concept that emphasizes infrastructures as processes and evolving, and emphasizes the active role of the researcher in examining them. And some nascent works are starting to apply this concept to the study of internet governance and of digital sovereignty. And in terms of the material for this study, we draw on qualitative analysis of the QUIC EHF mailing list, and we complemented it with 15 semi-structured interviews, about half in person at EITF Prague and on video. So we do not have time to go into the details of the controversies, but we can come back to it in the questions. Just a few words on what were the three controversies that we looked at. So the first one is the fallback option. What, in very, very short, what happens if a QUIC connection fails? What can one fall back to? The cryptographic models attending it, its nature, its scope, is it mandatory or not? And the spin bit. So can it be a specification or not? Should it be mandatory or not again? We can see that the outcome of this process, as an early 2024 study by Cisco showed, has been somewhat of a silent revolution with Google at its core, as we can see from this traffic evolution data graphic. The percentage of QUIC traffic has substantially increased in a number of areas in the world in the past 5 years. So Clement, please move forward.
Thank you. So as we've seen, QUIC has now become a reality for the internet. And so we've tried to study how it has operated a massive shift in the internet industry with potentially long-lasting implications. And in the final part of our paper, we try to reflect on what does this mean in terms of the evolution of the global internet. Because from a technical standpoint, QUIC is a fundamental evolution for the internet's core architecture by bringing everything at the application layer, making most of the layered models that have historically represented the internet almost, and I quote here one of the research respondents, irrelevant abstractions. So this shift also invites for discussion about the implication for the process of internet consolidation that we actually already mentioned in the context of this call. I'll go to the conclusion because basically what we try to show with this paper is that QUIC has fostered a momentous architectural change in the ways in which communication and data packets transport happen on the internet. We've investigated the QUIC standardization process as a site of infrastructuring, where different social technical dynamics emerge between various actors, including the giants of big tech, but also nation states. We've tried to demonstrate that QUIC process infrastructures as a verb, reconfigurations in power balance and in the respective weight between those actors, with obviously long-term consequences. And ultimately, this research tries to contribute to unveil a number of insights related to the place of the private sector in standardization processes. Even bigger, are influenced to some extent by the making of standards and the extent to which discussions and controversies on specific technical aspects of a standard actually reconfigure broader balances of power and decision-making for the present and close future of the internet. And I think we'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca and Clément. I really thought that was incredibly interesting, showing the pivotal role of Google there as well, as part of the corporate sort of influence in standards development bodies. And without further ado, as we are short on time a little bit, but we're currently to time, which is excellent, I'm going to hand over to Nick Merrill, who is a research fellow at UC Berkeley. Nick, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. This is some early stage work, and as a result, it is unfortunately text heavy, graph low, because I'm talking mostly about kind of some new-ish ideas. And this talk is called Corporate Influence in Standards Bodies. So a bit of background: corporate power shapes open standards. We have heard about this already a bit today. IETF, QUIC, we literally just heard about kind of a canonical example of this. You know, Google brings this this standard pretty much fully formed to the IETF. W3C, Web Integrity API, another thing coming from Google out of the Chrome team. Web Integrity API is a bit of a live wire. I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail here. You know, there are many examples like this. What really is happening here is situations where, you know, IETF becomes, as Corinne Kath said, this kind of nominally democratic space where in reality, and I think Andrew Campling used this word, at least first to me, these standards are effectively standards wash. They're cooked in corporate labs and come to standards bodies in order to be approved in a public seeming way. We could obviously measure this. However, it is unclear to me what we would learn, because we already have great data about corporate influence in standards bodies. Ignacio Castro just shared some earlier today. And also, you know, everyone who knows about standards knows how prevalent this behavior is. We know that this happens. What we don't know is what corporations really want from standards bodies in the first place. What we're missing, I think, is a qualitative theory that explains their participation in a fine-grained way in the specifics. So, for example, what incentives drive specific participation in IETF compared to, for example, unilaterally deploying certain standards and publishing them for others? Out-of-band coordination between competitors or even people who work in different sectors, and so on and so on. Why bother with all this messy pluralism? So some possible incentives. Companies want to keep themselves in business. The proposed standards help corporate bottom lines. This is kind of the obvious one. We know that. Still doesn't explain exactly why they would bother with messy pluralism. Now, often, you know, these standards are pre-competitive. QUIC is a great example. We actually do all benefit from more congestion control. And these are not always misaligned with private interests. I'm not here, as much as we all love to you know, use the big corporations as a punching bag. You know, a lot of what these corporations do is not necessarily misaligned with our incentives to make the internet high performing or what have you. They also may want to avoid antitrust concerns. So better to use nominally, again, citing Corinne Kath, open forum, than to be accused of any regulator as working behind the back of the public. And of course, you know, the critical thing about this forum is that non-corporate actors are effectively disenfranchised in a lot of ways. You're free to pass standards, but there's no guarantee those standards will be used. Also, and this is kind of, a mirror to these other two, it's a great forum to actually engage in anti-competitive behavior. Why not do a little bit of bottlenecking? Again, it's something we heard about earlier, either as a tactic or simply as an emergent property to suppress standards we'd rather not get past for other kinds of corporate reasons. Okay, why bother with this line of questioning? Why think about such abstract things? Well, I want to say something that will rankle quite a few people here. Corporate influence over standard bodies is not intrinsically good nor bad. It is possible that public and private interests are perfectly aligned when it comes to internet standards. What interests me about this is that corporate influence reveals the corporate preferences. We can study, and again, I think not exactly sure how we go about this methodologically, but it allows us to understand corporate preferences, which in turn helps us understand how corporations want the internet to be, where their incentives align and misalign when it comes to structuring the internet. Why do we care about this? Why do we care about studying their incentives? I think we want to avoid concentration. Nominally, that's the reason why we're all here today. I think avoiding concentration over the internet is an end in and of itself. Concentrating economic power, and I think infrastructural power and economic power are so linked as if it's hard to tell where one begins and the other ends. Concentrating economic power leads to concentrating political power. Piketty talked about this. Lena Khan, chair of the FTC, talked about this in Amazon's antitrust paradox. We've seen, I think everyone in this room knows that power over the internet and internet infrastructure absolutely leads to political power, and we care about that probably because we prefer power to be more diffuse. In fact, I would say that concentrating power is antithetical to the nature of the internet. It moves us from this network of networks more to a network of providers. Again, this happens in standards. This also happens architecturally when we think about the flattening of the internet and other related phenomena. And finally, there's this regulatory capture concern or a rich get richer concern that just because, you had some success in the past, now you get to lock in that success indefinitely by capturing the body that regulates you. So the worst case, of course, is that the internet is only upgraded in ways that are advantageous to existing players' business models. Broadly, I think that, trying to theorize here, trying to, even if it makes sense, make methodological contributions here is required. Helping us understand what corporations want from the internet helps us understand what we want from the internet. A lot of the time in these conversations, we make these kind of axiomatic assumptions that concentration is bad, corporate influence is bad. The internet has gotten quite good lately. Okay, and this is, I would say, from the kind of public interest side, it's almost taboo really to say this, but it isn't clear to me that anyone has really suffered from an end user perspective when it comes to a lot of this corporate control, corporate dominance. Internet performance has increased and enhanced, I think, broadly, in large part due to the flattening of the internet and due to corporate consolidation over what we might consider to be the internet's core. The question is where public and private interests diverge, and of course also converge. It is the divergence point in these public and private interests that we really want to understand in a rich qualitative way in order to help us understand what it is that we really need to shift and push about the internet. So what now? I think developing robust theories of incentives at the internet's core. This is kind of my in my interest in this talk. Who does what at the internet's core and why? These theories have to give us kind of falsifiable analytical purchase about why corporates bother with standards, help us articulate these mismatches and why we care about them, and all to help us answer, what really is our problem here? Why are we so concerned about this? And should we be concerned at all? Or, is this really all, private-led innovation happening exactly as, someone like Tyler Cowen might theorize it to? So some ongoing work on this. There's this paper with some collaborators called Can We Save the Public Internet? It's kind of a provocative or unusual proposal, which you're welcome to read, hyperlinked here, and I'll put it in the chat. I'm also working on some kind of, a naturalistic experiment about could we break up the cloud or introduce some competition within what we call, the cloud, basically the large cloud providers. This is a naturalistic experiment to investigate kind of divestiture from data centers. And all of this to kind of understand a larger question, again, raised by Lena Khan and others of the kind of neo-Brandeisian school. Is competition a remedy for market concentration here? Or are clouds, is the internet kind of an inherently monopolistic sort of a natural monopoly sort of structure? All right, well, I'll stop it there for now, and thanks for entertaining some early thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick. It's great to hear. So we looked at the case study of corporate influence within Quick. And then we also talked about the significance of incentives there within stakeholders and public and private interests and how they diverge and converge there. I would like to, it's great to see that the chat is kind of getting exciting. I'd like to open up to anyone who would like to speak. I see Alex Deacon on the chat sort of speaking with Lucas Pardue. So if you would like to speak, please raise your hand because I can see the chat is really getting exciting. In the meantime, though, I do have one question around, I guess for anyone on the floor, how does the quick development process reflect broader debates surrounding internet governance and digital sovereignty, particularly in light of sometimes limited engagement from public authorities in comparison, which was the case for Quick. So if anyone wants to take the floor here, Francesca, Clement, Nick, go ahead.
I can say a few words, if you want, on this connection between digital sovereignty and the development process of Quick. This was one of the research puzzles that we try to investigate and try to think that in a time when the EU and other actors were having their policy discourse around digital sovereignty, did it materialize also in the field of internet standard setting processes? And so we were looking for interventions to some extent from states in the context of Quick. So far, we saw only limited attempts, but I recognize a lot of participants in the room who were pretty active in the moment of the standardization process. So please let us know if you've seen more than that we've heard about. But what we also saw is a strategic move or shift from Google to try using the fallback as an escape hatch. So not only states were not involved, but proactively certain companies were also making sure that the opponents to Quick, let's say, and the ones that were asking for more manageability of the network to some extent, where their concern would be not only taken care of, but also to some extent dismissed. So there was, to some extent, this digital sovereignty debate was there, but it was maybe a bit more in the periphery than we were expecting, but it was clearly part of the process, I would say.
If I can add a quick thing. So one of the things that one of the final questions that we were asking to our respondents was if they thought that Google was developing in some way its own digital sovereignty by having roles in standardization processes such as the one it was the case for Quick. So just to point out that so digital sovereignty is strictly linked to nation states and what they do. Just to point out that examining the role of some very central corporations in standard setting processes can help to maybe shed light or nuance some definitions of what today is meant by digital sovereignty. And so we thought that it was. Of course, they won't call it that way. They will call it in some other way, and maybe it cannot even fully be fleshed out. But we just thought it was interesting to highlight.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I can see Lucas Pardue with his hand. Please take the floor, Lucas, if your mic is perfect.
Hello. If you can hear me, I'm Lucas. I am currently the co-chair of the Quick Working Group at the IETF, but a very long-time participant. I was tracking that work way back pre-adoption at the IETF, all the way from it being a Google experiment. I think, obviously we're very short of time. We only had a brief overview of some of the papers. I'm really interested to see the actual paper when it's published and have further discussions there. I'm intrigued by some of the points that were made. This focus on Google's kind of what sounded like Google driving a lot of that work. There was diversity of participants. The Google were authors on some of the drafts, but not all of them. And if you compare the protocol that was proposed through 34 different draft iterations across a number of years, including ISG feedback, IETF last call, et cetera, the protocol is fundamentally different within its own framing and packetization layers, which makes me wonder about the discussion about digital sovereignty and effectively what are we talking about Quick here? Like Quick is just the term, but actually it's composed of many different things. different facets. You also have application layers that sit on the top. I'm personally confused by what somebody who is representing government say and worried about their sovereignty, what they would have to say that isn't already affected by encryption, say TLS. So I would really like in the paper to be able to understand better the discussion topics, or if someone could respond quickly, because fundamentally, what does quick change? It effectively protects more of the wire image at the transport layer. Personally, I don't see where governments would care necessarily about how to do loss detection or recovery of packets. If they do that, have they already participated in prior transport working groups such as TCP or DTLS or SCTP? And if they did, why did they feel that they couldn't participate in Quick this time around? So yeah, but thank you very much for this session. It's been very interesting.
Thank you, Lucas. And I will briefly just give the floor to Francesca, Clement, and Nick. Nick may want to come in here just briefly before we finish the session. Nick, do you want to finish with anything on your presentation?
I enjoy this discussion. I'm glad we have industry representation here. I think that often, we talk about the public interest. I talk about the public interest, and there really is no one public. There are a lot of different publics in different countries, and different countries have different incentives. And often, one thing we see is that, Europe has often very different ideas about what sovereignty might look like from the US. And there are different legal theories in different countries about what we care about. Niels was in the chat. I was just about to respond saying, this is a freedom, security, innovation, and privacy issue. Well, exactly one of those things has legal standing in the US as a reason to take regulatory action, and that's economic innovation. So, I think that these different publics have different ways of approaching this. And I wonder from the perspective of fragmentation, whether those different legal traditions and different remedies, as people start to look towards sovereignty and take sovereignty seriously, is really going to be the cause of fragmentation ultimately, rather than kind of this, private public or Huawei or whatever it might be. It's like, the US cares a lot about innovation and takes action on that. The EU cares about other things, takes action on that. And we're all sitting around very confused about why we also care about such different things. So maybe it's these political economy factors that are going to matter most. Again, this is kind of the spirit of why I'm bothering to ask these questions.
Thank you so much, Nick. Andrew, I'm so sorry you keep coming in at the very last section of the session, but I'd encourage you to ask your question at the end of the next session, and hopefully you can get in there first because we've got very short amount of time. So that was a perfect segue to looking at the geopolitical context. I will hand over to Carolina, who will go over that over the next half an hour with our presenters. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Georgia, and apologies, we're having to move swiftly. So we're now on to our third and last segment for today's roundtable discussion, which will focus, as Georgia said, on the geopolitical context, domestic prerogatives, global standards. In this last segment, we wanted to pick up more directly on the impact of geopolitics in standards development, which I think it's a theme that's somewhat been coming across some of the comments on the chat. We see multiple manifestations of geopolitical contestation in standards. One aspect for sure is the growing interest of states and regional groups for engaging more visibly in standards. We also see regional and domestic prerogatives also playing a role in influencing alliances and priorities for specific countries, particularly those across the global south. So we have two presentations actually that pick up precisely on these 2 points. So let's go over to those. I will first invite Roxana Radu from the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford for her presentation, Opening Internet Standardization to Political Interventions. Roxana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Are you able to see the slides?
We are. Please go ahead.
Thank you. The big challenge now is to fit everything in 5 minutes. Well, my very best. I'll start by saying that I've studied internet governance for a really long time, and we've always known that standards are somehow political, but they have never been as political as they are today. And that's what grounds this paper, where I plan to do a qualitative analysis of some of the strategies that countries have employed in the last couple of years to be more vocal in and more active in standard shaping at the international level. So in a way, we've moved away from a clear distinction of market-driven standards and then state-backed. That was the stories of the early 2000s. By now, what we're seeing is a mixed picture, and there are many nuances that are worth exploring. So I'll start with this. Why are standards at the top of the political agenda? They haven't really been since the 80s, if I got this correctly. For some of the early internet governance literature, there was an entire focus on protocol wars. And I'm using here two memes just to capture a bit the effect of those. One is we did not follow the standard or the protocol that was agreed in the 80s. So the TCP/IP ended up being the victorious one. And the success is seen in the current internet. It's been now 50 years since that was put forward. But what we're seeing as of 2020 is a highly politicized environment around standards, particularly around 5G, the role of Huawei, and so on and so forth. But I'm claiming it doesn't really stop there, because we're seeing at the international level a number of attempts to capture this space, or to really put forward a clear government vision as to what should be done with global internet standardization. And everybody knows a little bit about the Chinese approach with the Belt and Road Initiative. Part of that was the 2017 Digital Silk Road strategy. And within that, of course, they're having many different projects implemented, and indirectly, those projects also meant applying some of the standards that Chinese companies developed. We've also heard about the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which had a particular working group on coordination for standards. But I'm also looking at more recent initiatives, and one that stands out is the UN Tech Envoy expert group on digital public infrastructure. So the report just came out earlier this year. I think it was actually just last month. This is around digital public infrastructure, which refers to an open set of technologies that are designed in the public interest. Now, India was behind this initiative in the very early stages. They also have lots of national examples of how this has been applied, but taking this to the global level is an interesting move from the point of view of what that means for standards. And the report takes a very different approach than what we might expect. In fact, the report outlines categories of risk. And standards appear in the three categories of risk that they identify on the normative level, on organizational level, and also on the technical level. So going from dividing the world into different digital blocks, all the way to either having an institutional void or having too much in terms of institutional overlap and then creating the confusion. If we go to the regional level, we're seeing, again, a lot of activity around the EU efforts. And Clément has written a brilliant paper on this in 2023, and I recommend reading that, where together with his co-author, they look at consistency across the EU agenda, in particular on two levels. One is around the digital sovereignty discourse, but also I would add around the leadership that the EU wants to see at the global standards level. And they claim there is quite a bit of inconsistency in terms of how this is operationalized and finally applied, because the EU standardization strategy ends up with a lot of focus on EU bodies and an internal look rather than that global outlook we would have expected in this positioning. There's also a little bit of that, of course. There's particular attention paid to certain countries on the African continent, And here, obviously, ideological and democratic practice alignment also matters. There are also initiatives that have not really come out with a formal document we can analyze, but the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms had a follow-up. So this dates back to 2014, but it has an action plan that mentions standards. I'm still looking at some of the other regional organizations. And then at the national level, very interesting, lots of activity since the beginning of this year. Prior to that, again, quite a bit of focus in the gray literature on the Chinese standardization process, and a little bit of media attention to the UK international technology strategy. But more recently, 2 countries have come up with their own policy on how international digital policy should be coordinated. So we have the German strategy and the US one that is only 3 days old. And they put forward very different perspectives. So this is what I found so far. And again, a caveat here, the research is ongoing, but I think it's worth keeping in mind some of these trends as we move forward in the discussion. First, we're actually seeing less focus on global cooperation and a move towards these club formats. There's a real politicization in very clear terms, and I would argue this is quite unprecedented. The national strategies go as far as very clearly mentioning we will not work with those that do not share our values. It's clear in the UK one. We can say the same about the German one. There's a clear focus on who is sharing the same democratic practices or democratic outlook and who is not. So very much splitting around authoritarian versus democratic divides. There's very vague language in terms of the institutions that they are prioritizing, which I think is quite interesting because that leads us to the second point around the emergence of specific platforms. Here we're seeing all of these different groupings, not necessarily generally promoting multi-stakeholder cooperation with some exceptions, but not necessarily pointing to existing institutions. We have the G7 focusing on digital standards, and so on, and pretty much strengthening that particular network. And then the UN report on digital public infrastructure suggesting an early warning system for countries that are adopting that technology. And that warning system would also look at standards. So that's quite an exciting development, but it moves away from what we knew as existing institutions. We also have a clear divide between statements and global initiatives that have prioritized a global internet. It's the case with the Declaration on the Future of Internet that has been signed by more than 40 countries in addition to the EU member states. But we're also seeing that a little bit of that in the DPI Digital Public Infrastructure report. However, other specific initiatives have really taken a tech approach. So they have looked at the technology rather than the standardization process per se. The UK has focused on AI and quantum, just like the US. And with China, we've seen actually mostly a focus on smart cities and really ecosystems rather than specific technologies. And this also speaks to some of the alternatives that China has sought in this space, moving away from this coordination for what happens in international institutions, international standard-making bodies, towards bilateral agreements, towards MOUs and so on and so forth. And by now, China has more than 90 such agreements signed with 52 countries. And that's really the de facto implementation of standards rather than the publicitization of the process itself. And I'll just end with what we kind of expected to see with this. There's an absence of the global south in this discussion, even though certain countries might be signatories of some of these statements at the international level. They don't participate actively and do not have a stated vision on how standards can develop moving forward. and that reproduces some of the current inequalities. I will just end by mentioning that whenever there is any reference to foreign assistance or capacity buildings, and many of the national strategies as well as the regional approaches have lots of references to that, there is a very clear distinction between those who are sharing the values and those who are not. So that pretty much reinforces that existing divide. And there isn't necessarily work towards global cooperation as such. There isn't work to separate the technical part of the standardization process from the politics of it. There's actually a clear coming together of these two. So I'll leave it here because I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to say that what these initial findings show is this new positioning of both leading countries, but also regional organizations on the issue of internet standardization, and this will have long-lasting consequences for the field. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roxana. I think that's a great scene setting, and just getting this idea of how states are paying renewed attention to the field of standards, and they're using all sorts of, I want to say, tools at their disposal, like national and regional strategies. And I'm sure we'll unpack those a bit in the Q&A. I would like to invite our next speaker, Sani Alausa Isa from the Webfala Initiative, for his presentation, Enhancing Digital Governance in Africa, the Crucial Role of Standards Organizations in Shaping the Internet Landscape. And I understand, Sani, you're not using slides, so we're happy to hear your thoughts on the topic at hand. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Please confirm if you can all hear me.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. So our research is ongoing, just like you noted, and we're looking at enhancing digital governance in Africa. And of course, the crucial role of standard organization. We're prioritizing the African Union, but before we look at their roles, it's important to understand the context, especially for Africa. So some of the challenges that we've discovered during our research is the disparity in digital access and the digital divide. So it's been a significant barrier in achieving anything in Africa. We also have the regulatory and privacy concerns. That's also been primary issues in there. But looking at the role of the standard organization and primarily the African Union, there are a number of things that could be done, a number of things that they're currently doing, but what we have also observed is that there are a lot of theoretical formulations and no real actions are being carried out. Recently, we have seen the digital transformation strategy for Africa by the African Union. The plan is for 2020 to 2030 to harmonize digital regulations across member states. While that is available theoretically, the member states, including the African Union itself, have not done enough to make sure that these things become a reality. Of course, in our research, we are also doing a survey, speaking to people across different countries in Africa to see how the implementation of some of these strategies and the efforts of this standardization is going on in individual countries. So that gives us a broader view of how it is performing across different regions. A primary challenge also is the infrastructural development here in Africa. Although from the African Development Bank and the African Union, there is the program for infrastructure development in Africa, which also includes digital infrastructure. So the challenge is still the same. The efforts, the formulations, the policies are out there, but the implementation has not been the way it should be, as you'd expect from the standard organization. So these are some of the things that we are looking forward to, and the outcome of our research would have policy recommendations that cover some of the things that would expect that the standard organization prioritize going forward, especially with the 10-year plan that they have from 2020. This is 2024, and looking ahead, we have about 6 years to achieve some of those things. So I think that should summarize it for us. I hope I'm still within time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, very much within time. Thank you so much, Sunny, for that. I do see some movement in the chat, so I would like to encourage anyone that would like to raise their hand to do so. And I wanted to get started with a question, actually, something that I think ties across both presentations. And it's the notion of, Sunny, as you very well described it, we have the formulations, we have the national strategies in place. How much are we seeing those strategies effectively impacting standards development today? Do you foresee, perhaps there's no immediate impact today, but we're going to see that impact, within a specific time frame in the future? What are your thoughts on that, Roxana and Sunny?
Sunny, if you want to go first, go ahead.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Should I start? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So from my perspective, we are seeing many different strategies employed. So if you take the US national strategy now on digital policy and cyberspace, you'll see that they say they will make use of their full range of diplomatic and statecraft tools, and they are doing exactly that. So it goes further than just saying this is the vision and this is how we're gonna affect the current processes in existing institutions. Is really about exploring all the alternatives. At least that's what comes out of the research I've conducted so far. It's the same with the EU, and it's the same with China. And many of those alternatives involve institutions that are not already present in the ecosystem. So really going more towards bilaterals, MYUs, funding of all sorts, foreign assistance. So I guess it's useful to think of it in that broader perspective, but Sunny might have other views from where he sits.
Oh, all right. I think I agree with you, Roxana. And some other areas that I think would help is in terms of legislation. Some of these member states, for example, the legislations are outdated. The systems are not created to enable such standardization or progress in terms of internet governance. So these are some of the things that has to change for us to work with the current timeline. So I think if we get results in those areas, we are more likely to achieve better results than the pace that we are going, especially in Africa at the moment.
Wonderful. And I see we have Iwesi next. Iwesi, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
All right. Good evening, everyone. That's from my own part of the world. I don't know from your own part. It's evening from my part of the world. My name is Inweze Nwobilo, and I'm a senior program officer with Paradigm Initiative, and I work from Nigeria. So I'm so glad with this conversation, and my question is for Sunny, because I live in Nigeria, and and currently I'm doing something around this on engaging some of the standard development organizations. So I wanted to, I found out that when Sunny was talking, he kept mentioning AU. So I just wanted to know if your research was able to look at the work that African Telecom Union is doing as it has to do with standardization. Did you also look at what is happening at Afrinic as it comes to the domain name system management in the course of your research? Because I would have wanted to also hear what is going on from those areas, what as it has to do with Africa. Because we are also looking at how what happens in this area feed into what happened at the global level when you go to the ITUT and when you're going to World Telecom Standard Assembly. But I wanted to know if your work did look at the work that ATU is doing in Africa and the things happening with Afrinic that it has to do with domain name system. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that's very correct. Our work is also looking at the efforts of African Telecommunications Union. Of course, because of time limitation, we cannot cover all of that, but definitely our report is covering it and the impact of their role in internet standards and ensuring compatibility and efficiency across our telecommunications networks.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sunny, for answering that. And yeah, we look forward to the final piece of research. I thank you, Iwesi, for raising the point about issues such as AFRINIC or what the African Telecom Union is doing in terms of understanding sort of the position of African states in different standardization processes. I don't see any more questions from the audience. I did want to ask one more of my own. I was actually interested in connecting perhaps with the prior session on the role of corporate actors and ask you to speak a little bit to how that sort of ties with geopolitics. So specifically in SEOs that are industry-led, and I'm thinking here, say the Internet Engineering Task Force, is it fair to say that political contestation does manifest through corporate stakeholders, perhaps as proxies? Is this something that you have looked into? And yeah, do you have any comments to that?
So I would say, Carolina, that we're seeing a more clear intentional involvement of governments. So when you look at some of these strategies, they really speak about coordination with international partners to affect what is going on in existing bodies, but also to set up alternatives if they are not happy with the existing processes. So in a way, it's also a consideration for how you might potentially bypass SDOs that are present. So we are looking at a future that might not be dominated by an IETF type of body for AI. We know that already. We don't have the same open processes, but we're also looking at the future that probably makes obsolete some of these organizations if we continue to see more and more engagement from a political perspective in how standards are coordinated. So with the EU Technology Council, with some of the other EU level strategies, we're really seeing that effort to have the coordination happening before you get into the discussions of these bodies. So all of it happening beforehand. We talked about corporate influence, and it's the example of what Google was doing right prior to that one particular standard. We're probably moving into something very similar for governments, having that very strategic leverage outside of the room and bringing that into the room. I think it's really exciting to go further with this research because it's pointing to many of the alternatives as well that are explored, which might mean certain groupings will prefer certain bodies and others will stay out of those discussions altogether.
All right, seeing we have no more comments, I think I'm ready to turn it back to Emily to wrap up the session today. And I thank you, Roxana and Sunny for your presentations.
Thank you very much, Carolina and Georgia, also for moderating and for organising such a fascinating selection of research outputs. I mean, from the first session where we heard from Ignacio about, thinking, well, all of these processes are open, so why is everyone saying they're so inaccessible? And looking at that very interesting data about the time taken for standardization, and then Stephen asking about, does working in different tools and different ways have an impact on the outcomes? From Yug, we would, using the case study of quantum, he's really looking at and asking, does authorship of an RFC make a difference when it comes to the speed at which standards are adopted? And this led to an interesting discussion and comparisons between the modalities in different standards organizations. In the second section, we were looking at corporate influence, and we heard from Francesca and Clément, who were unpacking the re-infrastructuring, if you like, as they called it, through the case study of Quick, and also what they called a silent revolution with Google at its core and the evolution of traffic. And Nick asked the organising question of what incentives drive participation in standards, and particularly of organisations that really have the infrastructural power to just do standardization in practice. Why do they bother? So again, you know, at that stage, the chat was completely on fire and continued to be throughout the session. Finally, with Roxana and with Sanni, we looked at geopolitics in standards, and Roxana making the point that, you know, we're hearing not just from one country, but from an increasing number of countries about, you know, who are articulating their digital strategies and placing standards really at the heart of it, with less of a focus on international cooperation, but more of a sort of clubby approach where there are even statements to say we will not cooperate with those who do not share our values. Roxana highlighted the absence of Global South, and we were really pleased in this selection of papers and scholars to have representation from Global South scholars. And finally, we heard from Sanni about digital governance in Africa, and this how he articulated so wonderfully the difference between the beautiful theoretical formulations, but that they were not translating yet into practical solutions. So here we had an amazing selection of scholars from all over the world who are looking at standards through different lenses. I'm really looking forward to reading these final papers. I'd like to thank all the participants, including the audience who played such an active part, and the Internet Society Foundation who made this, and RIPE NCC who made all of this project possible. So thank you to my team, Carolina and Georgia in particular, and to all of you for joining. I will now close the session and wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, as the case may be. Thank you all.